Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel and I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. So today I'm going to continue with our country studies. So we're taking an in-depth deep dive into different countries, looking at their migration experiences, and I'm starting with some of the most well-known countries having to do with migration. So today I'm going to start off talking about Mexico. So now in this first video, I'm going to talk about the history of migration in the Mexican context. If you're interested in what the current situation is and also more about Mexican migration policy, please check my other videos on that. But let's jump in and get started. So let's look first at the colonial era from around 1521 to 1821. So this is when there was migration to what was referred to as New Spain, and this was restricted specifically to Catholics with quote-unquote pure ancestry, so not Jews and not Muslims. So most immigrants were Spanish, but some other Europeans came from Italy, Belgium, France, Greece, and Ireland. Africans were also brought to Mexico as slaves, but it was mostly the indigenous population that were largely used for slave labor, so there was not as much African slave migration to Mexico at that time. In the 17th and 18th century, slave labor was also imported, but mainly from Asian countries. So Indians, Filipinos, Chinese, and Japanese arrived on the Pacific coast during this time, and also mostly as slaves. So moving on to the post-independence era, Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821. And upon independence then, the general colonization law was passed to help populate the sparsely occupied areas of Mexico, and incentives were also given. So this helped with internal mobility in Mexico. Land titles were available from public land. Settlers were also exempt from tax for 10 years. But by 1830, Texas had 70,000 American residents and only 3,000 Mexican residents. So at this time, Texas was still part of Mexico. But Texas effectively gained independence in 1836 before being annexed by the United States in 1845. And at that time, about 80,000 Mexicans were living in the territories that became part of the United States as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. So you can already see how just because of where borders had moved, people then looked like immigrants when maybe they wouldn't have been immigrants previously. So even without having to move, then they actually switched countries. So let's turn to the industrialization period between 1848 and 1930. So until La Reforma in 1854, non-Catholics were excluded from immigrating. But after 1854, this changed. Then we also saw mass immigration and expulsion of laborers from China to Mexico between the 1880s and the 1930s. So first, the Chinese were very much welcomed, and then later not so much. There was also a massacre in 1911 of 300 Chinese residents. They were killed and their properties and businesses were destroyed. So there started to be kind of more hate crimes towards the Chinese population, and later also deportation. So the foreign-born population in Mexico decreased quite a bit and was only at 0.5% of the population in 1900. It rose to 1% of the population by 1930, but it was back again at 0.5% of the population by 2000. So what's clear here then is that Mexico has mainly been, especially in recent years, but even earlier, a country of emigration as opposed to a country of immigration. So they've had more people leaving the country than entering the country. So let's look at emigration to the US between 1910 and 1964. And when we talk about emigration of Mexicans, it's really a story of emigration to the United States. The majority of emigration from Mexico is to the United States, and we'll see that also later with some numbers. But in the early 20th century, recruiters actually traveled to Mexico from the US to try to recruit laborers to come to the United States. Between 1910 and 1929, about 661,000 Mexicans officially entered the United States as contract laborers. But of course, when the Depression hit, those were tough times for the US, and a number of Mexicans were deported during this time. So an estimated 400,000 Mexicans were deported during the Great Depression. However, during World War II and afterwards, there was an increased demand for labor in the US, especially low-skilled labor, and then there was the creation in the US of the Bracero program that ran from 1942 to 1964. Through this program, approximately 4.5 million temporary migrant workers came to the United States. And the current migration networks in the US nowadays are often traced back to this initial Bracero program, which helped the creation of migrant networks and culture both in the Americas but also in Mexico. So let's talk about the era of undocumented migration. So this was really between 1966 and 1986. In the US 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act that I've also talked about in my video on the US, if you're interested in that, you can check out the link above. This is the first time that the US actually had quotas on people coming from the Western Hemisphere. And that meant that for the first time, Mexicans were subject to quotas, which they were not previously. And there were only 120,000 quota spots for all of the Western Hemisphere, which of course also included Canada and many other countries. So in 1964, there had been around 800,000 Mexican workers immigrating to the US. So you can see how from one year to the next, this shifted dramatically, and this had nothing to do with the actual demand for labor in the United States. Then we really started to see a kind of development of a deportation regime in the United States that highly affected Mexicans. There was kind of no path to legalized status, but at the same time there were lax border controls, and all of this made an ideal workforce for employers that was vulnerable. So people were vulnerable to being deported, and employers still needed them, so there were lots of risks of abuse in this kind of a system. Between 1968 and 1976, the number of those people who were deported jumped from 151,000 to 781,000. So really a huge jump in this less than 10-year period. However, many of the people that were deported immediately traveled back to the United States and did this multiple times. Then there was really an increased border control since 1987. So the US 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, also known as IRCA, was another turning point for migration to the US. So at this point, 2.3 million Mexicans were legalized in the United States. But at the same time, there was heightened border enforcement, and the Immigration and Naturalization Service budget increased by 50%. At this time, there were also starting to be fines for hiring unauthorized foreign workers. So now employers were starting to be penalized for hiring foreign workers that were in the country irregularly. Of course, this act, this IRCA Act, had an unintended consequence, though, of turning what was previously circular migration, so people coming back and forth between the US and Mexico, and really turned this into permanent settlement. Now, because it became more difficult to go back and forth, people just decided to stay instead of returning back to Mexico and coming back whenever their labor was needed, and often in a seasonal fashion. So the cost of crossing borders irregularly highly increased, And people also know that there was a small chance of being caught once inside of the United States. So this really stopped the circularity in migration and turned a lot of that into permanent irregular migration to the US. There were also further enhancement of border controls in the 1990s and 2000s, but the demand for Mexican labor in the US actually hadn't decreased. There was just more and more enforcement of irregular migration along the border. So you can see that this is also a system that is ripe for long-term permanent irregular migration in the United States. Then there was the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. So the Free Trade Agreement was signed between the US, Canada, and Mexico, and the initial intention of this, at least from the United States side, was to reduce migration by increasing the export sector in Mexico. So what we saw is that trade between US and Mexico tripled, but at the same time, subsistence and small-scale farmers were not able to compete with large US agribusiness, and many then turned to emigration as a source of livelihood. So actually, part of the consequences of the North American Free Trade Agreement were also to stimulate more migration, which it was an unintended consequence of the policy. Mexico now actually imports half of its meat from the United States, while Mexican migrants increasingly work as meat packers in the Midwestern US states. So Mexico is importing more and more US products, but Mexicans are often the ones helping to create those products in the United States. At the same time, wage differentials have continued to exist between the two countries, meaning that there was still a good reason for Mexicans to move to the United States for higher wages. So since 2001, there has been really a fight for reform in the US, specifically with regard to Mexican migrants. The DREAM Act was created, which is the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. It has been debated in Congress since 2001, but hasn't been able to be passed. There have been major pro-immigration demonstrations in 2003, 2006, and 2017 in the United States, but this hasn't done much to change the situation of the DREAM Act. In 2012, Obama signed the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or the DACA program, as an executive memorandum. And what this did was allow children who allowed people who had been brought to the US as children and irregularly a path to be able to stay in the US in a documented fashion. And around close to 800,000 applications have been approved. And this is and most of these are for Mexican migrants in the United States. Now, what we can also see is that at these different points in the migration history of Mexicans to the United States, we see them also having different kinds of jobs. So we have the period of, here in this graph, you can see data from the Mexican Migration Project. What you can see is from 1900s to 1941, the majority of the people who had been working at that time in the United States were really based in agriculture or as unskilled labor. This continued definitely during the Bracero program between 1942 and 1965, but then we start to see a bit more differentiation, especially when we go into this kind of really undocumented era between 1966 and 1986. You already start to see more diversification. So you see services becoming more and more important, still general unskilled labor, and agriculture still playing a prominent role. Moving forward, really since 1987 or so, you see services becoming more and more important than general unskilled labor and agriculture. And also skilled labor has increased quite a bit. And nowadays, from 2007 to kind of present times, we see a massive increase in skilled labor and services, and those being the dominant categories for the occupation at the first trip of Mexican migrants to the United States, at least in this data. So moving on to some more data from the Mexican Migration Project. Here you can see border crossing costs. And just as I have talked about how policy has also changed in the US and how there's been more and more border control, you can see that the cost of migrating to the US irregularly and crossing the border has increased exponentially, really from around $1,000 in 1975 to now close to $10,000 for a crossing. So this, you can see, again, more incentive than to stay in the United States once someone has been able to cross, because the costs of crossing are so high at the moment. At the same time, you can see that the Border Patrol budget here in this graph, which is from the American Immigration Council, you can see that the Border Patrol budget has increased dramatically. The numbers here are derived from the U.S. Border Patrol, particularly on the southwest border sectors. And you can see that the budget for the Border Patrol has increased also dramatically from 1990 to 2020. Of course, then, at the same time, you can see the probability of return also has decreased a lot in this same time. Again, unintended consequence of these policies is that you have less circular migration and more permanent settlement in the United States. You're seeing less and less return or probability of return after crossing into the United States. There's also been a crackdown on transit migration coming through Mexico. And this has very, very much to do with US policy and with the Trump administration. So in June of 2019, under the Trump administration, the US launched the Remain in Mexico program. And the idea of this program is that Central Americans coming through Mexico to try to claim asylum in the United States need to actually wait in Mexico for their asylum processing. For their asylum processing in the United States, they need to wait in Mexico for that. So in November of 2019, over 36,000 asylum seekers were sent back from the US to wait in Mexico. So 69,500 individuals also applied for asylum in Mexico, also in 2019, which it was on 137% increase from 2018, with an average of 5,900 applications per month, which was something that also the Mexican system was not used to handling. So most who attempted to enter Mexico were actually deported or voluntarily returned also during this period. Here in this graph, you can see the monthly evolution of asylum claims in Mexico in different years. So from 2014 to 2019. And what you can see is that the second half of 2018 to the beginning of 2019, for which this data is coming from UNHCR, saw extreme increases, much more than Mexico had seen previously. Now, as far as UNHCR keeps data, looking at UNHCR's person of concerns in Mexico in 2019, you can see that there were an important chunk of the people in Mexico at this time were Venezuelans who had been displaced. You also have actual refugees who've received status, and then you had a large number of asylum seekers, some stateless people, and then a large number of others of concern that were based in Mexico at that time. Now, while the Mexican government has taken initial steps to strengthen its asylum system, their system still remains understaffed and under-resourced, which has resulted in a huge backlog also in cases. So in 2019, 200 UNHCR employees were also deployed to Mexico to help with the Mexican system at the time. Mexico has continued to receive asylum requests during the pandemic, but it has also had trouble processing these at the time, which has just created more and more backlogs. According to human rights groups, as of May 2020 and since June of 2019, there have been at least 1,114 publicly reported cases of murder, rape, torture, and kidnapping, and other violent assaults against asylum seekers forced to wait for their U.S. court dates in Mexico. So you can see that this is a very vulnerable population who has also been targeted in Mexico. According to a January 2020 estimate by human rights groups, the U.S. authorities have sent some 27,500 asylum seekers to the Tijuana, Mexicali region since June 2019. Tijuana was the world's most violent city in 2019, according to yearly rankings by the Mexican research organizations. Also, the Ciudad Juarez, where the U.S. government has sent at least 18,000 non-Mexicans to await their asylum hearings, ranks as the world's second most violent city, according to the same study. So what you can see here is that under this current policy, which basically Mexico was more or less strong-armed into agreeing to, with President Donald Trump basically threatening to put tariffs on Mexican goods, basically forcing the Mexican president to agree to these stipulations. Now the U.S. has been sending back people to Mexico to await their asylum claims, and this has been really detrimental to the human rights situation of many of those migrants coming from Central America. So I hope this is giving you now a little bit of an idea of the evolution of the migration situation in Mexico, starting from before independence and the colonialization period to modern day. If you're interested to learn more about what the current situation is and look a bit more at Mexican migration policy, please check out my other videos on this. You'll find them in the description below. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe to the channel. Feel free to share these videos. I do this all to try to make sure that more information reaches the general public. Please also hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of my other videos, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.